Okay, are we all set?
We are, thank you.
Okay, so slide one. I still think Michael is an enigma in the JFK assassination. Almost 25 years ago, I gave a speech on Michael and Ruth in which I called them the couple we love to hate. But I don't think that's really accurate because the research community has primarily focused on Ruth, while Michael remained in the shadows. But there is much more to Michael Paine than 60 years of history has given due credit. Today, I would like to bring him to the forefront and into the light. So slide two. Part one. Today, let's get to know Michael Ralph Paine. In fact, there's so much to bring to your attention about Michael that it simply cannot be done in a single 50-minute presentation. Dun, dun, dun. That means you'll have to listen to me yet again another time. But today we will start at the beginning, the family ancestry he came from and why they are important to us. His move to Texas to act on his dreams of invention success that led him to work for Bell Helicopter will be examined and hopefully dispel some of the common myths that have survived unchallenged for decades. The political thoughts of Michael Paine are so important because without learning about those that influenced him, we cannot understand why he was so intrigued with Lee Oswald. I think you might be surprised at the source of some of those that did inspire him. In 1963, we know that the rising stars of the Oswalds entered the Paine universe. The similarities between the two couples were amazing, considering the cultural backgrounds from which each had emerged. Michael and Lee were the political ones. Ruth and Marina were more domestic, each having the primary duty of raising young children. This is how they forged their friendships and came to be involved in one another's lives. Okay, slide three. The family background. You'll see Forbes, Cabot, Perkins, Emerson, Paine, all well-known Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Connecticut names that had come to this country and had already started to amass great wealth. To begin to understand Michael, we have to start with his ancestral background. Some of us outgrow our families, but in these closely knit communities, offspring were born with expectations hanging over them. You'd be hard-pressed to find more illustrious individuals linked through one man, Michael Paine. Through much of the assassination literature, there is a discernible difference between cultural factions in America. What Carl Oglesby called the Yankee Cowboy War back in 1976. The Southern faction was identified as blue-collar, rural, and uneducated. In contrast, the Northern faction was white-collar, urban-based, and scholarly. November 22nd brought the two groups together in a mighty clash. The questioning at the DPD was Southern to Southern minded, but the questioning by FBI and Secret Service was primarily Northern to Southern minded and couldn't have represented a bigger contrast. Later in the Warren Commission testimonies, the difference in vocabulary and grammar is distinctive. A series of very suitable marriage alliances with the immigrant aristocratic New England families that were descended from landowners in England significantly elevated their social and economic standing. Slide 4. Lineage. There is much detail available on the ancestry of the Forbes Cabot Paine lineage. The Forbes family dates back to 1763, when John Forbes left Scotland and settled in Massachusetts. I'll say here, you know Forbes magazine and Malcolm Forbes and that clan. They are not related at all to the Forbes in our study of Michael Paine. They came to the United States much later, and there's no ancestry that overlaps between the two groups. Marriage into the Perkins family, successful shipping merchants, yielded a fast path to the China opium and silk trades. A mid-1800s marriage to the daughter of Ralph Waldo Emerson brought a philosophical bent to the family. Ruth Forbes' marriage to Lyman Paine Jr. completed the circle with strong links to politics. The Cabot marriages also connected the Forbes to other seriously wealthy families, and the Paine linkage could boast a man who had actually participated in the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or as you call it, what the War of what do you call our War of Independence? You call it
We call it the American War of Independence.
Is it? Okay. I thought I had gotten a history book once, British, when I was visiting London, and I was fascinated by what it was called. So anyway,
Revolutionary War is another term.
okay. So now we've coupled religion, philosophy, and politics with great wealth. Slide 5. There are some family themes, and through all three primary families, Harvard reigns supreme as a beacon of intellectual interest. Sons, especially, were expected to graduate from this Ivy League school, make connections, and plot out their future. But that didn't mean that artistry and dreamers were excluded as careers. Vacations found the families on Nashan Island, a private island owned by the Forbes family just off Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard. Michael describes summers there and the overwhelming feeling of historic importance from the achievements of the men in the paintings on the walls. Besides the main stone house and gardens, there were beach cabins of various sizes. The size of your house depended upon where you were in the hierarchy of the Forbes family. When people died, you moved up to a bigger house. And the picture on the slide there is the main house, what they called the big house, not a prison, but the big house that was built as the primary residence on the island. When people died, you moved up to a bigger house. There were no cars, so you got around by walking, biking, or even by horse and buggy. When you talk to the Forbes family members today, their reverence and respect of Nashan is apparent. They almost whisper to me about it, as if they were, entering a church or something, which is amazing that even the current generation feels this strong attachment to the island. It's a place where life has always been made to seem the most sense to them. They speak of the palpable presence of ancestors, but for Michael Paine, strolling through those hallways and viewing the litany of people in the paintings, he never believed he could live up to the Forbes background and achievements. Although he had always vacationed there annually, and when he married Ruth, they continued the annual trek together in the summer. When his marriage fell apart, Michael stopped visiting. He felt his failure in his ability to sustain a nurturing marital relationship was not in the Forbes or Emerson playbook. Like any careful study in our research, to understand Michael Paine's actions, you need to understand the life events that built the man. Slide 6. Before Michael Paine met Ruth in 1955, he had led a certain kind of life. Meeting her was a pivotal point in his and represented the first time he stepped completely out of his well-insulated environment. But in that pre-Ruth phase, the first 27 years of his life, there is much to learn and understand about the man. From a young age, Michael had a destiny to fulfill. As he matured, he considered himself a civil libertarian and believed that he is free who lives as he chooses. Sounds somewhat Emersonian to me. He was a child of divorce by the age of 4. 6 years later, he overheard a conversation that there might be an energy crisis and dreamt of one day inventing a car that was so energy efficient it would be functional and low cost. Michael's family life drifted until his mother met and married Arthur Young when Michael was 18. By this time, he had already lived in New York, Santa Barbara, and Cambridge. As one looks at Michael's life, drifting is a word that often comes to mind. Immediately after high school, Michael was accepted into the fall 1947 term at Harvard. His two-year sojourn at the institution was a complete disaster. Majoring in physics, he could barely pull D's, and when he finally slipped to an F grade, the administrative board voted to dismiss him at the end of the term. Side margin notations in his file describe him as shy and lazy. Disenchanted with the educational environment, Michael worked at Granby Construction in Colorado for a brief period as a common laborer. But Granby also failed to provide resolution for the troubled young man, searching for a way to bridge his sense of privileged intellectualism and his need to identify with the common man. The fall of 1950 found him at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, studying physics, math, and chemistry as majors. He left the school within a year after failing 4 courses, still lacking that elusive degree. He was obviously embarrassed at this second academic failure, so he misrepresented why he left college twice, not so much for academic reasons as for personal difficulties. The lack of graduate status didn't seem to hinder Michael's ability to secure a job in his chosen field of study, physics. In 1951, he worked at the Bartol Research Foundation at the Franklin Institute of Philadelphia in their nuclear research lab. That's pretty heavy stuff. He worked with Van der Graaf generators, making counters and instrumentation to run the machinery. This job lasted 9 months and was only interrupted when his student deferments expired. Both of these companies had affiliations with Swarthmore College, and this is likely why Paine was able to work there without a completed degree. He was drafted into the U.S. Army midway through the Korean War, serving 2 years in the 40th Division as a combat artilleryman and intermediate speed radio operator in Japan and Korea. He rose to the rank of corporal, 3 levels above entry level of private, and was decorated with awards of United Nations Medal, Korean Service Medal with 2 Bronze Service Stars, and the National Defense Service Medal. But before you start thinking he was some kind of neocon during his stint in the Army, you should know that all 3 of these medals were awarded to everyone who served during that war. Glad to be past his obligatory military service, Michael rewarded himself with a short trip to Europe, traveling with the Swarthmore Presbyterian Church Choir. When he returned, he started working at F.T. Griswold Company, engraving precision scales in a state-of-the-art machine shop specializing in machining and manufacturing of optical measuring equipment. Griswold was a noted race car driver who broke all kinds of records, and he eventually started this company and wanted to be on the other side of the business there. Michael was living in a converted barn on his mother's property in Paoli and only had a 10-mile commute. A new phase of his life started when he met Ruth Hyde in 1955. Slide 7. Michael Paine's character. This section is a little lengthy because it's really important to dig into what this man was all about. It will help us understand the actions that he took, what he thought, and what he did in 1963. People always say that Michael Paine is one of the nicest men they have ever met. Interesting, I've heard that also about Buell Wesley Frazier. But that charming exterior masks Michael's largest character flaw, which is his utter lack of self-awareness. He's cognizant that something is wrong, but his is a life filled with apprehension and anxiety about living up to expectations and being outed as a fraud. Although he was quite observant of others, family, friends, co-workers, he was nearly blind to how he was really viewed by others. It is really no surprise that he lived a life devoid of a really romantic or loving relationship, not with his wife or his children. Michael's relationship with Ruth was very odd and unfulfilling, even before they married. For such an empathetic person, when Ruth forced the issues of love relationship, he told Ruth that he didn't really love her. How's that for forging a relationship? But he thought he was expected to marry and have a family. What one woman wouldn't swoon over being told that? She told him to get lost and go find someone to love. After a year of searching, he meekly returned and they married with the blessing of the Quaker elders in late 1957. From the start, he felt trapped, and the birth of his 2 children only intensified his early midlife crisis. Michael used their mutual love of movies and madrigal singing to connect with Ruth, while she used the fundamentals of her Quaker faith to connect with him. His primary socialization was through the madrigal singing, which he found through local churches in the Dallas area. In fact, he and Ruth actually had met the Oswalds through his friendship with a fellow choir member, Everett Glover. But the move to Texas had lifted both of them out of their liberal social comfort zone. Surrounded by right-wing conservatives, both Michael at work and Ruth in the Fifth Street neighborhood where they lived, they were far away from lifelong family and friends. Thus, neither had a common caring support group to help bring them back together. A summer visit by Michael's father, Lyman, in August of '62 may have been the catalyst to move him into action. He had always admired his father's ability to act on his beliefs, no matter how disruptive to the status quo. The next month, Michael moved to an apartment near his work, out from the home. He still visited Ruth and the children at least twice a week and ensured their financial needs were met. Every Friday when he came over, he used to deliver the weekly check to Ruth, as if he was delivering, the normal Friday paycheck. Not even the trauma of the assassination convinced Michael to move back in with Ruth. It was only a few days later, around the 24th or 25th, when his landlady told him he was being evicted from his apartment, that he actually took action to formally return. For the next 7 years, Michael may have been physically present, but he remained reserved. He left Bell in 1967 and built his long-dreamed-of workshop on the Rock Island Road property he had purchased in '63. This was the dream of the Old Barn Research Lab in Paoli during the years of his marriage come to life. In this secluded wooded area, Michael was never happier than when he was in a workshop or lab tinkering away at something mechanical. It was at these times that he could lose himself in his thoughts, his dreams, and his flights of fancy. Both in '63 and later in 1970, Ruth was the one who decided that she deserved much more than her marriage was providing. She was the one to file for divorce, and Michael simply accepted. There was no large financial settlement. Ruth got the house, a car, and the kids. Michael got his workshop and his car. Shortly after the divorce was finalized, Ruth and Michael couldn't leave Texas fast enough. But Michael didn't want to return to Paoli, and he had tired of working a structured 9-to-5 job. So he decided to completely change his environment. He could walk away from his wife and his 2 young children, but he would not be parted with his machine shop equipment from what he considered his greatest accomplishment, that Rock Island Road workshop. Perhaps in a shout out to his ancestor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Michael decided to turn his back on his privileged life and redeem himself by good works. So he moved almost 900 miles east to the John C. Campbell Folk School in Brasstown, North Carolina. In these rural mountains dedicated to fostering creativity and community-mindedness in partnership with his local community, Michael found a home for 3 years. He carved and whittled to exhibit his own creativity. From there, he again packed his precious machine shop equipment and settled at the Twin Oaks community in Northern Virginia. There was no cost to join the community, no rent, no ongoing costs associated with living there. As a small utopian experiment, where the least sought-after jobs commanded the highest wages, one had to make choices about how they would live each day. Michael did domestic chores, including latrine duty, and even wove hammocks, surprisingly one of the highest-paid jobs. After 7 years, he was nearing 50 and also tired of that mundane and unchallenging life. He went back to Massachusetts. He created a large workshop with his beloved machine shop equipment where he could focus again in his comfort zone. He started to talk about an idea for a very large helicopter that he had been thinking about for decades. His vision was that the aircraft would be cheap to make and would enable one to do logging by cutting up a tree in the forest and then easily removing it. No more floating logs down the rivers and loading them onto massive trucks for transport to a sawmill. He approached Bell and presented his idea. Their response was a big thumbs down. Personally, he continued singing, dancing, and ice skating, all hobbies he enjoyed. He tried a second marriage to Carol Voigt from 1987 to 1996, but divorced for the same reasons that caused his first marriage to fail. Research in the media really rarely reached out to him, as Ruth was considered the prime catch and headline grabber for assassination news. During this time, Michael had not been involved much with his children. Lynn was nearly 12 and Chris just 9 when the final divorce came through. There was no fight over the children as Michael did not want even weekend responsibilities. So Ruth had been given full custody. This was the same attitude his father, Lyman Paine, had held when he gave up custody of Michael and his brother Cameron nearly 40 years earlier. He paid his child support, about $650 a month in today's dollars, and made sure they all received anything they needed. He still had access to his trust fund and other financial opportunities from the Forbes company. But he didn't help in their personal development. Ruth, Chris, and Lynn had relocated to Philadelphia, where Ruth found the emotional support she needed after her 11 years in Texas. They then lived in southern Florida for many years until the early 80s when both kids were eager to leave the nest. Lynn had very bad memories of Texas. She was 4 in 1963, and she suffered from severe allergies, and she was baffled when Marina and her children suddenly disappeared from her life on that Saturday after the assassination. She followed a spiritual path and joined a Wicca group in Massachusetts in a small town near her father. She changed her name to Tamarin Laurel, a name that had come to her in a dream years earlier. Michael helped her overcome zoning rules and purchase land in Middlefield, Massachusetts. She started an occult bookshop that morphed into a full-blown supplier of metaphysical, spiritual, and gift items, shipping worldwide from an 18,000 square foot warehouse called Azure Green. You can find that on the internet, and you can take a look at it, and it tells you a lot about her philosophy of life and her life partner. Chris also had issues with his Texas experience, although he had been much younger. He has said, "I was born in a suburban Texas wasteland in a nuclear family catastrophe. Life has been improving ever since." He followed his grandparents, Arthur and Ruth Young, to California, where they had established the Institute for Consciousness in Berkeley. We'll talk more about that later on when we talk about them. He joined the team there for nearly 15 years until they died. Then he began searching for land on which to build a commune and sustainable land-based environment in Sebastopol, which is in Northern California. By 2004, he had lured his father to the West Coast, where they purchased the Wild Nest, 150 acres of undeveloped forested land to expand his small compound ranch. They called the site Green Valley Village, and it continues today. You can also find that on the internet if you want to take a look at it and see pictures of it, etc. Both children married partners very similar in temperament and philosophy to their own in 2002, relations that are still sustained today. Ruth relocated to Santa Rosa, a mere 7 miles from where Chris and Michael were living the commune life. On Michael's connections to his religious roots, he shows no better understanding or commitment to a true belief system associated with any organized religion than any other areas of his life. His choice of church was primarily led by the availability of a choir he might join. This was by far his chief form of socialization. But even in that environment, he did not form any lasting friendships. Like Ruth, Michael Paine always took the high road when he met people, no matter the circumstances. He would assume anyone to be honest until given good reason or absolute proof otherwise. A man ran into the back end of his car, causing visible damage. While Frank Krasinik, his coworker at Bell, was worried that Michael had no interest in getting the man's name, serial number, license number, insurance info, or even filing a police report. Michael simply said, "The man said he would pay for it. I took a man at his word." During his life journey over the years, Michael questioned his purpose in life, how best to fulfill his destiny. Just 5 years before he died, he signed up for the Sonoma County 50-plus singles meeting group. In his introduction to the website, he said, "I'm 85 and am tired of the single life and would like to find a congenial partner. That eventually led full circle back to the Friends retirement home where Ruth lived. Slide 8. Let's dive into Bell Helicopter. By the late 50s, the Dallas-Fort Worth areas were centers for oil and gas, financial services, defense, aviation, and aerospace. Bell is a well-known name for industry, invention, and manufacturing. Bell Telephone began in New York in 1877, founded by Alexander Graham Bell. Now, William Avery Hyde, Ruth Paine's father, worked at Bell Telephone shortly after he was married and relocated from the West Coast. Bell Aircraft was started in 1935 by Larry Bell. The two men were contemporaries and were not related, so they don't come from the same ancestry or lineage at all. In 1953, Bell Aircraft had the second largest manufacturing facility in the U.S., and it was located at Hurst, Texas. While Bell Aircraft was heavily involved in nearly all forms of aeronautical endeavors, Bell Research Lab in Arlington, Texas, was all about vertical lift aircraft. This lab was created in 1959 and still exists today, though it has been greatly expanded as a flight research center. Their primary customer is still the U.S. Army. Slide 9. I was really interested in digging deep into some of the myths that have come about regarding Bell Helicopter and Michael Paine. But I think there are several misconceptions about Bell Aircraft and the relationship to Michael and the assassination, and I'd like to review 5 of those. Myth number 1, Arthur Young worked in all research areas of Bell Aircraft. As a young man, Arthur Middleton Young was fascinated with ham radios. His first mechanical engineering endeavor was to build his own set from scratch parts. After college, he decided to work on the problem of the helicopter, which at that time had a long history of failure. There were 3 or 4 different people that were very interested in helicopters, and no one was really moving the thought forward on it. Helped by his boyhood experience of making model sailboats, he began his work by making model helicopters. This self-imposed task would absorb him for almost 19 years, 12 of them on his own, and the last 7 with Bell Aircraft Corporation. Using his models and working in a barn in Radnor, Pennsylvania, Young discovered how to provide stability through the use of a stabilizing bar. He gained the interest of Larry Bell at Bell Aircraft and assigned all of his patents to Bell Aircraft in late 1941, agreeing to work for them exclusively for 5 years. This was finally his chance to build full-scale rotary wing flight vehicles. He worked with a five-man team in Gardenville, New York, in relative secrecy. He essentially created that lab for Bell. In 1946, the Bell Model 47 was awarded the world's first commercial helicopter license. This model proved so successful that it continued to be manufactured through 1974. That's a long stint. Young left Bell in 1947 to concentrate on what he called the next phase of his life. This was his long-held fascination with the merging of scientific theories to the philosophy and metaphysical side of mankind. He was toying with the idea of what he called the psychopter, which was the winged self. In his mind, the helicopter he had created was the mechanical manifestation of the self. Arthur Young believed that the real function of science was the exploration of the human spirit. My conclusion, the myth is not true. The myth being that Arthur Young worked in all areas of research at Bell. He worked on the vertical lift vehicles only. Myth number 2, Michael wasn't qualified for the job he got at Bell Research Lab in Arlington, Texas in 1959. There certainly was some form of nepotism in Michael Paine securing a managerial level job at Bell. He didn't even have an undergraduate college degree. But what he did have was a stepfather who many considered the father of the helicopter. Enter Arthur Young into the Forbes Paine family. Michael Paine left Griswold after 3 years of engraving precision scales in 47. Without a college degree in a scientific field, a good paying job was hard to come by. So his mother's new husband, Arthur Young, offered him work making helicopter models in their personal lab that was in the converted barn. Since Michael also lacked good relationship skills, he preferred to work solo. In this style, Michael was creative and an excellent out-of-the-box thinker. He would later remember the next 8 years as the happiest of his life, doing work he loved at a pace that satisfied him. Much less pressure. In mid-59, Bell's chief engineer, Bart Kelly, who had started at Bell at the same time as Arthur Young, approached him about helping to set up a research lab in Texas. Just as he had built the Glenville lab 18 years earlier, Young agreed to do so if he could bring along his son-in-law to work by his side. Kelly agreed, and they signed a 3-month contract, which turned out to be a little longer than Young needed to create the lab and set it on the right path. By 1974, 2/3 of all helicopters produced in the world had been designed by this lab. That's pretty incredible. Michael Paine had married Ruth Hyde in 1957. She was not willing to be the stay-at-home wife and mother and had tried to continue her inner life and intellectual capacities. In the summer of 59, while she was away at an immersive Russian language course, Michael broke the news to her. He had accepted the offer from Arthur Young, and they were all moving to Texas. He went on ahead and left a 7-month pregnant wife to pack for the move. Tell me if that sounds like anyone we know. Perhaps Mr. Lee Harvey Oswald himself. At the lab, he initially functioned as an engineer and was well respected by the team that Young was bringing together. When Young completed his contract and returned to Pennsylvania after 2 months, Michael was formally hired at an entry-level position as design engineer class 1, earning about $150 a week, which in today's is about 1,300 pounds sterling. Give you an example of that. Michael rented a little apartment in Hearst. Ruth joined him immediately and noticed the change in his attitude. In 1997, Ruth told me he was a whole different mode because he was really delighted to be earning his own money. And he had gone out and gotten a really nice speaker in hi-fi. And I'd never known Michael when he was really feeling like spending money. It was fun. While Paine thoroughly enjoyed the opportunities to contribute groundbreaking, newly fashioned ideas in helicopter and aeronautical design, he was being forced to grow up. He no longer could work isolated in the lab, ignoring the hours he toiled over the craft he loved. After a few promotions, he ceased to accept any further elevation. Now he was an administrator, responsible for budgets, project deadlines, and the management of his staff. He had moved a step away from actual design, his true love. In 1963, when Michael met Lee Harvey Oswald, he was still working on the new concepts in helicopter design, but he felt in a rut. His real dream was to quit his job, live in an old barn, like in Paoli, and design an airplane so cheap, so functional, so exquisitely economical that people could own it the way they own cars. As a visionary as well as a scientist, Michael hoped that with so many people flying over national frontiers, borders might be wiped out entirely. My conclusion that he wasn't qualified for the work to do there is a myth, and it's not true. Myth number 3, Michael Paine worked at Bell Helicopter in Texas under Nazi scientists Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun. This is probably the one that I hear most often in the rumor mill. After World War II, the U.S. and the USSR competed for the top German scientific talent available. Via Operation Paperclip, 108 German scientists, engineers, and designers were brought to America. The military was scrambling as the Air Force and Army competed to capture their services. Although Dornberger and von Braun worked together in the research lab in Germany during the war, They came to the U.S. 2 years apart. After initial orientation at Fort Bliss Army Base in Texas, each was sent to separate geographical research labs. Dornberger went to Virginia, and he was focusing on supersonic aircraft and ballistic missile systems, while von Braun was sent to Huntsville, Alabama, and he worked on space flight. Braun became the director of the Development Operations Division of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. While there, he developed the Jupiter C rocket, which was used to launch America's first satellite. Much of his work became the foundation for the 1969 moon mission. In contrast, Dornberger spent time developing guided missile systems for the U.S. military before becoming an engineering VP at Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York. He stayed there for 15 years, and he developed Bell's Rascal, the first guided nuclear air-to-surface missile. Neither of these men had anything to do with the military vertical lift research and the design that Bell crafted at Arlington, Texas. In some researchers' zeal to develop a Nazi link to the assassination, these two men are the candidates most used to develop that connection. As an aside, I have to say, even if those two men worked at the lab, so what? Are we going to condemn all the people at NASA that worked with von Braun for the space missions and that? So I think it's a red herring. It's something that doesn't really have any significant impact. But I happen to believe, based on my research, that they did not have anything to do with the lab. So my conclusion is that the myth is not true. The fourth myth is that Michael held a top-level security clearance at Bell. Design engineers use their technical experience to develop innovative and ingenious solutions to highly complex and technical problems. Since the primary client of Bell Helicopter was the U.S. government, they have become a target for speculation about what was really happening at the research lab there. Well, as it turns out, what they were doing is exactly what the defense contracts under which they operated required. The engineers were to design, develop, and create prototypes for vertical lift aircraft to be utilized in a war environment. No secret, that was the mission. This meant they needed to be efficient, rugged, and capable of ferrying heavy-duty artillery. The pressure was on to provide appropriate vertical lift vehicles to serve the military's covert plan to escalate the war in Southeast Asia by providing air assault, troop support, medical evacuation, and close air support. The U.S. government understood that the USSR and China were providing military equipment to the North Vietnam contingent. Interesting work for a born and bred pacifist like Michael Paine. The security clearances required at the research lab were determined by the U.S. Army within the parameters of the Department of Defense under Robert McNamara at that time. In this instance, there were two security issues. One was the need for secrecy about the fact that the lab had a mandate to create such a superior war-ready vehicle. The other was the actual designs in the minds and documents of the employees attempting to create the ultimate flying machine. This was important because the foreign-made MiGs were smaller than the Army helicopters, and it was not thought the Russians were close to scaling up their crafts. The research lab was given a specific geographic identifier, with the U.S. Army assigned as a responsible security agency, and the U.S. Navy and Air Force as secondary parties. The national adjudicative guidelines were used to grant, deny, or revoke a security clearance. Access to classified information depended on the level of clearance you have and the information you needed to know to do your job. The Army had three primary levels of security based on the level of seriousness that unauthorized disclosure of information could cause to our national security. Confidential level represented damage, secret level represented serious damage, and top secret represented exceptionally grave damage. Michael Paine had the lowest security level, confidential, primarily because of his father Lyman Paine's close connection to Trotskyite politics. Lee Oswald's Russian magazines delivered to the Paine house in Irving would have only reinforced that low level. And I want to remind you that security levels can be very subjective. The Warren Commission, an unprecedented federal investigative entity, found it necessary to classify the testimony taken from witnesses under oath as top secret. So if you go to the National Archives and you look at the original transcripts that are typed up on 11 by 14 size pages, at the top and bottom of each one is a bright red stamp that says top secret. So by comparison, when the landlady of the Oswalds in New Orleans, Mrs. Jessie James Garner, testified, her information was deemed to potentially cause exceptionally grave damage to our national security if it were ever leaked. Kind of shows the bizarreness of those top secret classifications in some cases. My conclusion, this is not true. He did not have a top secret security level. Myth number 5, an FPCC flyer was posted on a bullet board at Bell. This is the one that I find the most fascinating. Has anyone heard of this rumor? Show of hands. If you've heard of it? No one's heard of this. In the 1990s, a rumor started circulating through the research community that a Fair Play for Cuba committee flyer had been seen on the bulletin board at the Bell Research Lab in Arlington. I heard different versions, some saying it was there before the assassination and others saying it was seen after 11/22. But in both versions, someone at Bell took the flyer down without a lot of fanfare. I first heard of this from a telephone conversation with Jean Davison. She's the author of Oswald's Game. In the 90s, when she told me someone on the Prodigy message board, that shows you how old this rumor is, they had posted that they knew a Dallas resident who had actually seen the flyer at Bell. Those were the only details she had, and she had not done any further research on it. Without actual proof, we might just say this is a myth with nothing to back it up. But if we take the stance that it was true, there are several areas to support such an action. We know that Lee Oswald dabbled in infiltrating the FPCC. If for no other reason, then we have film footage of him passing out leaflets supporting the cause in front of the Trademark Building in New Orleans in the summer of '63. But working with the FPCC was in direct contrast to his recent associations with the White Russians in Dallas and the Cuban exiles in New Orleans. We also know that copies of those flyers showed up in the possessions of the Oswalds found during the police search at the Paine house. So this would mean that the Paines did have access to them. So a logical conclusion might be that Michael either brought the flyer to the lab to share with coworkers and left it behind where someone else posted it, or he asked someone else to post it initially, or Michael Paine posted the flyer himself. Michael was talking to some coworkers at Bell about Lee Oswald. For all his shyness and insistence on protesting Oswald's privacy, he was gossiping that Oswald's pregnant wife and child were living at his home in Irving, that Oswald had trouble holding down a job, and that Oswald had lived in Russia and now espoused very liberal political ideas. Did that include Oswald's praise of Castro? The key time that Michael indicated an opinion on Cuba was with the SMU students at Luby's cafeteria on Sundays after church. Was he sincere in expressing admiration for Castro and his plight, or was he just taking that stance to foster debate? If his thoughts were legitimate, then this might dovetail with the sympathy for the position Oswald advocated. In the fall of '63, when Michael resumed his discussions with Lee, did he tell him about these discussions with college students the previous spring? I wonder. Michael never said that Lee told him about getting arrested in New Orleans for passing out hands off Cuba flyers in August, months after Michael was chatting with the SMU students. But if Oswald had told Michael about this incident, leaving out having gone to the Cuban exiles earlier to express his opposite opinion, that would have improved Michael's opinion of him. This would have been an example of actually taking action and not just posturing. So the question remains, did Oswald show him one of his precious flyers? The list of Michael's co-workers who might be willing to post this flyer is short. Fellow engineers like John Craig, Frank Kristenek, and Ken Samble all liked Michael and might have performed the task for him. But why would they risk their own jobs in doing this? All had families and recognized that they were beholden to the military contracts for their own livelihoods. Security guards notoriously kept an eye on postings around their plants or offices, and alert management is needed. Did Ted Sherman, the security guard in the lab, spot it before 11/22, but either stuck it in a file or threw it away? If he took it down on or after 11/22, then he knew of the connection and saw the significance. Either way, why wouldn't he have reported that information when he was interviewed by the FBI? Well, often we get the answer from witnesses, nobody asked me, so I didn't tell them. Given all that, Michael could be said to have a motive, means, and opportunity to post the flyer at Bell. But the question then remains, why would he? Surely he did not think he would find support for Castro in such a right-wing organization strongly aligned with military guidelines. So where does this leave us on this myth? I still have far too many questions to offer a conclusion on this one. Did the person who took it down do it to protect Michael? If Michael had put that flyer up, did he go to the bulletin board on Friday afternoon or Saturday when he was in the office to take it down and find it already missing? Did Michael take it down and give it to someone else or throw it away at Bell? And it was then found by someone else? Did it come down before, on, or after 11/22? Lots of ways this could have happened. And of course, if Michael had been involved in this incident, he might have been too embarrassed to have voluntarily admitted it to anyone, not even Ruth. I haven't found any FBI or Secret Service report discussing this alleged incident to give us more information. My conclusion, we cannot yet prove or disprove that myth. So that gives you a little snapshot into Bell. Let's go to slide 10. I want to zero in on two people that were colleagues at Bell today. Michael had other co-workers there that he was friendly with, but these two are important to us in our assassination research. David Wakefield Noel, his name is usually misspelled in documents with just one L, who went by Dave, was 22 years old when he graduated from Arlington State College and began to work as a co-op student engineer at the research lab. A co-op engineer means that they are still in school, not yet graduated, and they go to work in a lab environment to augment their studying for a degree in engineering. He was excited about the opportunity, and he was blown away to work with someone so close to Arthur Young, who was an idol to most of the people he worked with. In 2001, when I caught up with him, he was 60 years old and still vividly remembered that summer. He told me, I liked working for Michael. He was quiet and fair. He was one of the few people in the office I could discuss politics with, although I was more moderate in my leanings. Dave said he was used to discussing current affairs and events with Paine, and he remembers that he and his boss often had lunch at a local cafeteria, the same place they ate on the day of the assassination. On that day, on their way to the bowling alley where the cafeteria was, they began discussing the news on the radio about the Kennedy visit and the right-wing threats being made. In fact, people at the research lab did not especially like Democrats, especially Kennedy, and often made crude jokes about the president and his wife. Noel had actually seen the wanted for treason ad in the paper that morning, so the topic was very much on his mind. As they reached the table, Noel and Paine began a discussion about what makes an assassin. They were wondering what kind of person would do such a thing. At the time, it seemed perfectly normal to Dave that they were discussing this. In retrospect, he thinks Michael was personally struggling with Lee Oswald and still trying to figure him out, and determined if he was capable of violence toward anyone. He had once heard Paine discussing someone he did not know with Frank Kristenek, and Paine remarking, I may have gotten in over my head. After a waitress interrupted their lunch to say that the president has been shot, they thought she was making a poor joke, but they walked over to some people with a transistor radio and heard the newscast directly. They raced back to the lab right away, where Michael called Ruth to tell her the news and to turn on the radio. He was informed that she and Marina had already heard the news. They thought that Michael left work within the hour. But back to work on Monday, Dave remembers that Michael was even more subdued than normal. He had seen the CBS interview aired locally on Sunday and realized how Michael and his wife had been sucked into quite a mess. Yet Michael tried to explain his plight to coworkers, and Dave recalls that when he had to take time off to go to Washington in the spring of '64, Michael was tense before and after. They still went to lunch together, but only occasionally. Dave also told me that he eventually held a secret, that's the middle security clearance level, which was common for the designers, and that others on the team all knew that Michael's level was below theirs, never above confidential. He said it was sort of a joke because he saw all the documents and the sign that we did. So that was an interesting conversation with him about those security clearances. Raymond Frank Kristinick, who went by Frank, was 31 and 63, so he was close in age to Michael. He had joined the Navy for a 2-year stint after high school graduation, and while working at Chancevot Aircraft Aviation in Dallas, he met his future wife, Charlotte. He returned to the U.S. Navy for a 2-year stint as an air traffic controller at the Naval Air Station in Dallas. His father-in-law was Vernon Dersch, a chief petty officer, also stationed at the naval station. He attended both Arlington State College and Texas A&M and started at Bell in mid-1960. He met Michael when he was given an assignment in the research lab a year later. Frank was a conservative Catholic family man, and they shared mutual interests in their work and basic social values. The two couples socialized frequently until the Paine separation. After that, Michael was a frequent solo dinner guest at the Kristinicks. Michael had shared information on the new young couple he and Ruth had met. Frank remembers that Michael was somewhat intrigued by Lee Oswald, but thought he had a lot to learn about life, even with his world travels. Michael told Frank that Oswald was a misfit and not capable of holding a good job, pretty much generally dissatisfied, and didn't accept the responsibilities for his family. Nothing about what Paine told him made Frank want to meet Oswald. But on October 25th, Frank did come face to face with Oswald when Michael had shown up with him at an ACLU meeting in Dallas. Frank recalled, "The first notice I made of Oswald is when he stood up and made a remark about General Walker in reference to him not only being anti-Catholic, but anti-Semitic in regard to his comments about the Pope." After the meeting had ended, Lee and Frank talked about economic systems, and in particular capitalism in the U.S. Michael walked away, having heard Oswald's take on the subject before and knowing he could not be influenced differently. Frank offered what capitalism could offer the average man. He boasted about his own home woodworking shop where he manufactured birdhouses and occasionally employed 3 men in the manufacture of these birdhouses. Rather than be impressed, Oswald accused Kristinick of exploiting his workers. Frank retaliated by calling Lee a communist, but was quickly corrected. "I am a Marxist," he remembers Oswald saying very proudly. After that, Kristinick told Paine that he never wanted to talk with the man again. Frank told Michael that Oswald was arrogant and talked down to people. They both agreed that even though Oswald used a varied vocabulary, he didn't necessarily use the words correctly. Paine continued to discuss Oswald's antics with him and even sought advice on the sheltering situation the Paines had found themselves drawn into. Kristinick knew of Ruth Paine's devotion to the Quaker religion and that Michael tended a Unitarian church. He thought Michael had sympathy for Lee and was possibly trying to convert him. Later, after Oswald secured full-time employment at the depository, Michael told Frank that things were improving for the Oswalds, and this might mean that Lee could begin to assist in the support of his wife and 2 daughters. On 11/22, the Bell office had listened to the president's speech from the Texas Hotel parking lot in Fort Worth. In contrast to Michael's opinion, Frank felt that people at the lab liked Kennedy. When the radio news announced that it was suspected that the shots firing at the motorcade had come from the depository, Michael told Frank that Oswald worked there. Frank responded that Michael should call the FBI, but Michael felt it was not his place to do so, even though Frank persisted. In fact, Michael was in denial and said, "I don't see any way in the world it could have been him." When they announced that the president had actually died, he saw Michael exhibit real outward emotion. Frank recalled seeing him with his back turned and his head down slightly. He saw him really crying. But when they heard just 30 minutes later that a police officer had been shot and killed in Oak Cliff, Michael became restless. Frank remembers that within the hour, the name of Lee Oswald had been aired, and Michael reacted with disgust by saying, "The stupid, he is not even supposed to own a gun." Michael left the office shortly after to go to Irving because he was sure the police would be descending on the house any minute. He did not want Ruth to have to face that alone. While Michael had confided in Frank about his frustrations with Oswald before the assassination, after he was murdered on Sunday, the man was an even more frequent topic of discussion. Frank felt that Michael was continually trying to make some rational sense of the man. It was much easier for Frank to write Oswald off, especially after being told he had been dishonorably discharged from the Marines. Frank always found Michael to have sensitive emotions and always careful not to severely criticize anyone or make unkind comments about other people. Frank told the Warren Commission that he didn't know how Michael spent his time off in his association at work, and the few times in his home, he said he had come to love him as much as his own brother. So there was a very tight friendship there between those two. And those are the two of the most fascinating people that I find at Bell. Slide 11. Shaping Michael's political thought. How was he influenced over his life? It evolved based on the cultural environment in which he was raised. As a young adult in his 20s, he was conflicted with his military service, lack of educational interest and success, and his valid concerns about his general attitude toward life itself. He was an intellectual and accustomed to thinking in abstractions, but as an inventor and scientist, he liked facts. He wanted to have a unified political belief, but was overly cautious about deciding on something only to find that there was important information he hadn't considered, and that didn't fit into his paradigm. Overall, he wanted to understand the workings of the right-wing mind as much as he did the left. There were 5 main political philosophies that competed for Michael's allegiance: Marxism, Trotskyism, communism, democracy, and pacifism. Most were in conflict with one another. So Michael Paine seemed to have taken pieces of each to create his own political leanings. Let's see where they came from. Slide 12. His father, George Lyman Paine Jr. He was a promising architect in New York who had graduated from Harvard, like many of the Paine men in his family tree before him. The early years of his marriage to Ruth Forbes produced 2 children, Michael in 1928 and Cameron in 1932. He met Freddie Drake, a workers' rights advocate, and she influenced him in moving his political views to her own bent, which were Marxist and Trotskyite. He was an award-winning architect at the New York City Housing Authority and became disillusioned that his work designing housing projects to produce social improvements was too slow in providing much-needed change. In contrast, Freddie was participating in worker rallies and protest marches. He divorced Ruth and left his children behind, seeing them only occasionally. He also traveled to Oslo, Norway, to meet with Leon Trotsky, representing the Trotskyite group in America. When Michael had been around 13, he had asked to accompany his father to a socialist meeting in New York during Freddie-mandated visitations. He remembered witnessing intense discussions, even if he didn't quite comprehend the meanings of the debates. After marrying, Lyman and Freddie moved to Los Angeles and became actively involved in a socialist splinter group, eventually leading the Johnson Forest faction. This geographical and philosophical shift effectively cut off any type of ongoing relationship with both of his children. Michael's father remained an elusive shadow filtering in and out of his life. Lyman's influence from the traditionalist Forbes family diminished as he ceased his summer visits to Nashan Island and replaced them with vacations in Sutton Island in Maine. The faction in Los Angeles was primarily run by Lyman and Freddie because they were the chief financial supporters and because of their close personal relationship with the founder, who was an avid Trotsky follower. As an adult, Michael remembered his father as radical, always looking toward the revolution to solve the country's problems, and having little criticism of Fidel Castro. These were all in direct contrast to his own views. Michael thought his father's political leanings became more moderate over time. But did they? As late as August 1963, while Ruth was traveling in the East with her kids on a summer vacation and visiting Nashan Island, Michael flew to California to visit his father for a weekend. While there, Lyman threw an eclectic party with an international guest list. Upon return, Michael raved to Frank Kristinick about this fabulous and exhilarating party filled with interesting people to chat with. Lyman's continued belief in the socialist system should have made Michael think of his new fellow he had met, Lee Oswald. Was this part of his fascination with Oswald, the similarities to his father's views? Even so, Michael didn't feel he had been influenced by his father to any great degree, or at least he wouldn't admit it. Slide 13. Ruth Hyde Paine's politics. Ruth Paine was exuberant, played tennis, and was always reaching out to find new friends. Michael Paine was calm, loved to sing, and solitary by nature. Because of her much more forceful personality, Ruth was a catalyst in their lives for bringing new experiences to the household. Ruth was led by what she called the inner light perspective of the Quaker faith. This led her to believe that her job was to change the world one person at a time. While still in Pennsylvania, she loved the Pen Pal program promoting East-West contact and communication, as well as meeting 3 Russian visitors after they arrived in the U.S. She became very disillusioned when she read a book by one of them about a year after their trip, as they represented America very unfairly, inaccurately, and with what she considered propaganda. Although both came from more conservative political backgrounds, Ruth broke the mold with much more liberal thought. She was a registered Democrat when she made her first presidential vote in Texas for John Kennedy in 1960. On election night, she held a small party at her home to watch the returns. Along with Michael, she and only one other couple were Democrats. They simply could not find any other non-Republicans to invite. Nearly all the neighbors on Fifth Street and at Bell Lab were not liberals by any definition. The first night that Ruth Paine met Lee and Marina Oswald at Everett Glover's party, she thought Lee was interesting, but she did not think he paid enough attention to his wife, who had accompanied him with their young daughter. She didn't really form any significant opinion about his political leanings. Over the next 7 months, she primarily left the political discussions with Lee to Michael. She simply had not developed a desire to be involved in politics at an aggregate level. She was similar to Marina in this regard. After the assassination, she realized how much she had missed her personal outreach, her form of political involvement. She became active in racial housing issues, education, psychology, and even Central American outreach. In realistic terms, Ruth Paine did not exert any real political influence on Michael. Slide 14. We're getting there. Ruth Forbes and Arthur Young. Not only Lyman Paine gave Michael a lot to consider politically. Both Ruth and Arthur Young were peace advocates who believed in participatory government by the people. They thought nothing of putting pen to paper to express a determined viewpoint regarding the threat of the bomb, nuclear test ban treaties, or United States involvements in international affairs and commerce. As members of the social and economic elite, those letters were read and consideration given. Michael's mother joined the World Federalist Movement after the dropping of atomic bombs in 1945. Arthur Young had also become profoundly distressed by the development of nuclear weapons at the end of the Second World War and decided that humanity needed a new philosophical paradigm. He met Ruth Forbes Paine in 1948 and recognized it a like-minded so. Before they moved to Texas, Ruth recalled playing a game at Arthur and Ruth's home in Paoli. The Youngs' friends were well-educated and socially conscious people. Standing in a circle, each guest was asked to choose to represent a different country. They would be given little placards that they pinned on their chests, naming the country that they had chosen. One country would pose a problem occurring with another country. Each country would then state their case. Others would then walk around the room and share one at a time, out loud so everyone could hear, their idea for resolution based on their own country's needs. The discussions would become very animated, but Ruth was fascinated at this political role-playing game, even though she didn't appreciate the intricacies of their debates. After the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination, and the escalation of the Vietnam War, Ruth Forbes Young consulted with United Nations General Secretary U Thant about setting up an international academy to support global diplomatic efforts towards world peace. She created the International Peace Academy in 1970, for which she provided initial funding and continued to support it financially. The goal was to create and foster sane worldwide conflict resolution. That logo up in the top right corner of the slide is the new name that they took on, I think about maybe 15 years ago, because they wanted to do more than research, they wanted to do more outreach. And so it's still in existence today, and they are very grateful to her for her efforts in doing that. While Arthur Young had an engineering and design background, he also had a deep appreciation of the metaphysical. His financial success with the helicopter made it possible for him to indulge that fascination. He spent years developing his concepts into written form. This resulted in his meta-paradigm, the theory of the process, which resolved the conflict between the findings of science and spirituality. Young recognized that technological advances had propelled society beyond its ability to cope with negative effects of progress, and that science provides no moral guidelines to control its own growth. This is so fascinating because of the situation that we find ourselves in now with technology and all the debate about AI and the positive and negative impacts of applying that into a variety of circumstances. And we're going through the same questioning now. We just had some hearings before our Congress about AI and what guardrails were going to be put in place to assure that there was not misuse of that type of technology. Ultimately, Arthur Young was very disturbed by the use of the helicopters he had designed and the degree to which it changed the nature of the Vietnam War. This led to Arthur and Ruth co-founding the Institute for the Study of Consciousness at Berkeley, California, as an opportunity to apply his theory of process. By 63, Michael had been witness to Arthur's intelligent mind in two aspects over 15 formative years, as the inventor and the spiritualist. Both influenced his thinking relating to understanding his world and how he interacted with people in his environment. In addition, Ruth Forbes Young remained a lifelong peacenik, and Michael knew of her constant outreach for world unity since he was in his teens. Slide 15. Michael Paine's politics. So where did he end up? In 63, the main people that Michael discussed politics with were Lee Oswald, his Bell co-workers, and some random SMU students. Other than ice skating, the movies, and the singing, he had no other hobbies that would be conducive to having such discussions. He didn't appear to have close friends outside of these limited environments. He never developed a close relationship with his brother and his family. He didn't read newspapers or magazines and mostly got his news from the radio and television. No wonder that when he first heard of Lee Oswald, he was eager to jump in and debate. His biological father, Lyman Paine, had clearly made an impression on him, but Michael's thoughts of workers' rights and social conscience were seen by him through a privileged lens. His life had been filled with so many advantages that the average man did not have available. Ruth and Arthur Young constantly showed him conflicting realities in a world that yearned for peaceful resolution. But other than his experiences in the Korean War, he didn't have a personal foundation on which to develop an independent paradigm of his own. The easiest way to describe the political thinking of Michael Paine is to say his view was just the opposite of Lee Harvey Oswald. And here are some key examples. Lee thought that any form of using manual labor in a business was exploitive. Michael supported the capitalist system of non-state-owned business ownership with a profit motive. He believed that everybody made more of a life for themselves under that system, both the employee and the employer. Lee thought that Russia was a better place to live, even though he defected there, found it lacking from his vision of paradise, and returned. Michael had generational deep roots in the United States. Although he also traveled outside the States, he had no desire to relocate to another country, even a democratic one. Michael still considered America to be the land of opportunity. Lee professed himself a Marxist as a political affinity. In contrast, Michael came from a Republican background with more liberal tendencies in the latest generations, but he did not favor socialism in any form. Lee was a staunch supporter of Fidel Castro and his rule over Cuba. Michael viewed Castro as a puppet of the Soviet Union. While he had nothing against the Cuban people, he was not in favor of the repressive regime. Lee used his political stance as an ego builder. Michael used politics almost as a rational, logical, and intellectual exercise. He did not show any connection to his personal life and circumstances. Lee thought one needed to be an activist in politics, even if it meant some form of violent revolution. Michael was a pacifist by nature. He rationalized his military service in the Korean War as legitimate based on defending a country from the attacks from another. He did not believe that violent revolution was the answer to the world's many problems. Lee expressed his political beliefs in a narrow, illogical, and dogmatic manner. Michael, in very sharp contrast, used politics as a debating tool. He would often take a side he didn't even believe in just to foster a lively discussion. One place where Lee and Michael did agree was not really political. It was the belief that the paradise each sought was just around the corner, that next job, that next commune, that next relationship. Lee searched for his nirvana for 24 years. Michael searched for his for 90. Slide 16, and we'll wrap it up here. And I will announce, stay tuned. I hope this has given you a snapshot into the life of Michael Paine, that it helped you to start to understand the man who needs much more examination and scrutiny. My question for Michael Paine in many instances is that old Watergate query to Richard Nixon: what did you know and when did you know it? Never was this more true than in Michael's interactions with Lee Oswald. In part 2, at another DPUK meeting, don't get worried, you're not going to get to your pub, we will explore Michael Paine in more detail. With the foundation we have now built, we can measure his 1963 thoughts and actions when he interacted with the Oswalds. The areas in part 2 will include the 6 key periods of the Paines and the Oswalds in 63, Ruth versus Michael associations with the Oswalds, suspicious Oswald sightings that might have a Michael Paine connection, the garage evidence that served to incriminate Oswald, Michael Paine under questioning, and other important loose ends that require more study. So if this has intrigued you, made you think about things, and you have any questions that you want to send to me that you would like me to include in part 2, be sure you cover this, Nancy, be sure you cover that. I'd be more than happy to get those in my email inbox. So that completes my presentation today.
Thanks, Nancy. We'll certainly do that. It certainly sets the scene as well for your next appearance, which could perhaps be maybe December or January. We're lined up. We've got Bart talking in October, and there's a bunch of us going to Dallas in November, and we're hoping to do something out there.
Right. I would say it's sometime next year.
Okay. All right.
I'm taking a break.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
But I think I'm pretty clever to do it in 2 parts, because then you have to bring me back.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that you want another appearance fee, so we'll,
I'm just a glory hog. I can't help it.
I've got it. I've just okay. No worries, Stuart.
No worries, and I'll catch up with you next.
Did we tidy up on the books with you? I forgot. We did. Okay. Well, I'll be in touch, Stuart. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed it. So a couple of questions, please, Nancy, before I throw it out to the floor. First of all, you referenced Jean Davidson's Oswald's Game. What's your view on that book?
Well, she didn't do any original research for it. Everything is taken from pretty much the Warren Commission. And so it's a good compilation of what the Warren Commission, pulled together, but I don't believe it really moves the marker in terms of understanding anything. It's definitely from the lone nut perspective.
Okay, well, that's great, because I asked Larry Hancock about Priscilla Johnson Macmillan's and Norman Mailer's, so I think we'll put it in that bin. Secondly, I'm probably getting ahead of myself in terms of the next presentation that you do. Obviously, you interviewed both the Paines decades ago. Is there anything, bearing in mind that we're doing Michael today, is there anything from those historic interviews, anything that he told you that alarmed you, shocked you, intrigued you, or enlightened you at all with respect, to the whole assessment?
Right. Okay, so I interviewed Ruth in person for probably about, I'd say 7 or 8 hours altogether. But I never interviewed Michael.
Oh, okay.
Okay. David Lifton did an in-person interview with him, and whoever has his documents, it would sure be nice to get a transcript or a video of that interview, because I believe it was filmed. So I just want to clarify that. I would say from what David told me about that interview, which was pretty extensive, our conversations on it, that one of the most shocking things to me was the whole incident with Will Fritz and the slap in the face, which happened at the Dallas Police Department that weekend.
You're not talking about Frazier, are you?
No, I'm talking about Michael Paine. When Michael Paine went back on Saturday, well, Friday night, they were all hauled down there, right? Everyone in the Paine house with Marina and the kids. And they got affidavits from Marina and Ruth, but either wittingly or unwittingly, Michael was not asked to sign anything, was not shown anything that was written up for him. Because the MO, of course, was that they would interview Marina and Ruth, and then a detective would write up, here's, as if it's in the first person. And that's why many of the handwritten documents that we see don't match the handwriting of the individual. It's because it was written by the detective. Then once they said, okay, that looks right, they would type it up, and then the witness would sign it. So it was, they were putting words in the witnesses' mouths. So they didn't do that. They didn't get that done Friday night. And all of a sudden on Saturday, Fritz realizes, as he's going through the myriad of affidavits, where's Michael Paine's? And they, we didn't get one. So they send detectives out to pick him up, bring him back on Saturday, and Will Fritz goes at him. And Fritz wants him to go and meet with Oswald. And so, on the little telephone thing through the glass partition. And Michael says, no, I don't have any desire to do that. There's nothing that I can gain from that, or you can gain, or anything. And so, and then Michael proceeds to talk about, and I'm not sure he really did it. And this enrages Fritz to the point that he just hauls back and slaps him. Now Fritz is a short guy, and Michael is 6'2". Okay, so there was quite a height difference there, but Michael didn't see it coming, because he wasn't a streetwise kid like Buell Frazier was. Okay, Buell Frazier had been hit enough by his stepfather as a child and teen that he knew to put his arm up to block it. Well, Michael probably had never been slapped before in the face in his life. So this was, he never spoke of this, okay? And I didn't know about it in 97 when I talked to Ruth, so I couldn't ask about it. I have tried recently to connect with her by telephone over in Santa Rosa, and she doesn't want to talk to me. So I think after Max Good's documentary, she's become a little more wary again. And so in November, I think she's going to confine herself to people that are like-minded, that Oswald did it alone, and we'll let her say her piece on that. So that was probably one of the most interesting things in Michael's interview, and especially it was years later that we heard from Fraser describing the same type of action from Fritz, and it tends to validate both parties.
Yeah. So the rumor mill is that Matt Douthit has got the Lifton archives, and both Paul Blow and I know Matt. And Paul, are you going to Dallas? Did you say you were going to?
Probably will be.
Yeah. So I'm going to follow that up with Matt Douthit. As I say, it's a rumor, so I don't know if it's true.
If he needs any help archiving, transcribing anything of David's work, my hand's up to volunteer.
Okay. Well,
free of charge. Okay, so if you want to communicate that in any fashion, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Well, we'll follow up. It's a rumor though, so it could be BS. And I just wanted to ask you one other thing, just to give you a new myth number 6. What do you think about the idea that Michael Paine was the guy who ran down the grassy knoll and got into his own Rambler?
I don't put much credence in that because that wasn't the car that he used.
Yeah.
Plus, they had the blue and white Oldsmobile car. They had 3 cars at that time, so it wasn't the car that he used. And there's other people. There's too many other people that whatchamacallit, can verify that he was at work and then he was at the Paine house. So I don't know where the timing could have been. There's a thing out on the internet about Linnie Mae Randall that I found the other day, and they are accusing her of being the person that drove Lee after the assassination. Not, and she would have had to take the bus to Dallas from Irving, and she would have picked up the car. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre, some of the things that you end up with. But I will. I'm just going to make a note of that to add that.
Well, it was said slightly tongue-in-cheek. I'll be honest with you. Next time I speak to you, I'll explain.
Okay.
Another question from the floor.
Yeah. Hi, Nancy. There was one quote that you put on the screen that was very interesting. It was what Michael said when he learned about Oswald being arrested. And he said he wasn't even supposed to have a gun. What does that mean? Supposed to?
What he was talking to Frank Kristinek, and there's some discrepancy about whether Michael said he wasn't supposed to have a gun or own a gun. Okay, so I'll start with that. Second of all, it helps us understand that Michael had seen that backyard photograph back in April 2nd, that first time that he went to pick up the Oswalds to bring them to Irving for dinner. So this, I found that fascinating, and that's in Frank Kristinek's Warren Commission testimony. Okay, so I think it begs the question: what does it mean? Yeah. What had Michael and Lee had conversations about that photograph, and like, whoa, you own both? Are those yours? And Lee's like, yeah, those are mine, and I'm proud of it, and all of that. And that with the FBI coming out to one of the things that Lee had told Michael was, hey, we're terrible here. We're not allowed to own a gun, and you have to belong to a rifle club in Russia, to have one. But he had mixed feelings about having rifles and stuff. I just said that backwards, didn't I? In Russia, you couldn't have a rifle unless you were in a club, a state-sponsored club. But in the U.S., of course, your dog wants a gun, go buy one. Okay, so it's only gotten worse over the last 60 years. So that tells me that Michael and Lee had conversations about weapons and guns and what you do with them, and that Michael wasn't an adult deer hunter. Okay, as a youth growing up, and he used to do some hunting with family members, but it wasn't an avocation that he really liked and did as an adult and didn't do in Texas. And he didn't own a weapon. So so that's my thought on that. It begs a new question.
Well, I don't know how long after the event was Christina remembering the words.
That would have been like in March or April of 1964.
Okay, so very soon after. So I would have thought if Michael didn't think that Oswald had a gun, he would have said, but he didn't have a gun. He wasn't supposed to have.
Right. The only thing Michael was asked was, because the Warren Commission was assuming that that rifle was in the blanket in the Paine garage. And so they wanted to know, did you know that he kept the rifle in the garage? And he's like, no, I didn't even know he had a rifle. So he flat out lied about it to the Warren Commission. And it was it was too bad. They didn't know enough to press the issue with him. Although, the testimony about the blanket, I mean, it makes you just almost want to scream, because him talking about, oh, I moved it and it was camping equipment. But camping equipment doesn't weigh that much. And he contradicted himself so many times about that silly blanket and what it could or couldn't have been. And so, like many other witnesses, it was poor questioning.
Well, we'll cover that. We'll cover that in your next presentation.
Yep. My only hope is that the questioning of Trump in the upcoming 4 trials will be much better than the Warren Commission did.
Yeah, there's one more question from the floor.
Okay.
Nancy, thanks very much for the presentation. Just one point, the FPCC poster that was put up in the Bell Helicopter Company, was there any evidence as to which group that came from? Was it New Orleans, or which group might it have? Who actually?
Which chapter?
Yeah.
Yeah. The question is, is there any colour on which chapter the FPCC poster came from?
There wasn't. Gene Davison didn't have details about whether it had the Camp Street address noted on there. But I don't know of any other flyers, just blank ones or ones that had the Camp Street. So
another group of the FPCC.
Genuine.
Yeah.
Like New York.
Oh, genuine. Okay.
So could it have been a real genuine group of the FPCC?
Okay.
Say the New York or whatever.
Well, that's a really good question. I hadn't even considered that and factored that in as part of it.
Yeah. Okay, well, something to look at. Look, Nancy, we're very desperately running out of time now.
Okay. Excellent. But remember, we started late.
90 minutes of your 60 minutes. So.
but wait a minute. We started late.
No, that's included. I've already adjusted for that.
Oh, okay. Never mind. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, and look forward to speaking again.
Okay, bye.